let's start with what seems like a sort of tension between people of how the economy is working for them. Full disclosure, I'm 60, you're not 60. I graduated from university in 1988. I went straight from university into a reasonably well-paid job in the British civil service. 29, I had my first child, and that was not something where I thought, my God, I'm never going to be able to afford this. So when I look at my kids and their friends, almost a different planet.
Yeah, so I'm 27. I graduated basically into the pandemic. And so what you're talking about feels very foreign to me, and it feels very foreign to the people that I know. For the older population, there was somewhat of an equation to follow. Homes were a lot cheaper, education had a more predictable return, things were not as expensive. And then, of course, every generation has their own challenges. But I think the younger generation right now, the under 30s, if we want to group it that way, is facing an uphill battle in terms of home ownership, in terms of saving, in terms of the labor market, in terms of inflation, in terms of a global pandemic disrupting a lot of young adulthood. So I think it's been challenging.
And do you kind of look at my generation? I mean, my son has just graduated with a master's in engineering, can't find a job. One of my sons lived at home last year. My other son is living at home this year. I mean, I can see exactly what's happening, and I might think, oh, well, it's just them. They're not finding jobs, and maybe they're applying wrong. But I can also see and sense from them a kind of growing frustration with the system as a whole. I mean, do you look at what I had and think, what the hell? Did you guys just take everything? Were we the take generation and we kind of left you guys with nothing? Did we do something deliberately to screw you guys over?
It's a generalization. Like 43% of boomers have no retirement savings, right? And so if I come out and I'm like, oh, all the boomers, they took all the money. No, like a certain number of them did. Yeah. They were handed a really nice bull run in the stock market, housing prices that have probably like quadrupled, if not quintupled over the past couple of decades, and a refusal to sell those homes. Like the number of baby boomers that own 3 bedrooms is more than the number of millennials that own 3 bedrooms, and you'd imagine the millennials, would be having those homes because they need to have families and children and space. And so I think for me, like, when I hear about, the older population and they have their own problems, right? Like, you all faced a lot of uphill battles too, but you were able to be on the like, sort of you were entering the world at basically a perfect time that we might never see again in history. You just got very, very lucky. And so I think we have to reset our expectations and realize that might not be the future, and we can't blame the boomers for taking advantage of that.
So that's interesting. So my generation is the anomaly. Is it just this post-war period that produced extraordinary growth and we were the beneficiaries of it, whether it was my parents' generation or my generation?
Yeah, I think it's the upward mobility too. Like that was you all lived the American dream. And now, it's Stephanie Stancheva over at Harvard has a great research paper out about upward mobility, and it does not exist in the way that it used to. And that is the American dream. It's like buy a house, have kids, have a job, and live. And I think that has disappeared primarily because the economy is now having some real repercussions from the post-war boom that the boomers were able to benefit from. But yeah, that was a big part of it for you all.
Yeah, you mentioned social mobility. There's actually, I think, the data suggests there's more social mobility now in the UK than there is in the US and in
Yes.
several other European countries, which sort of kind of defies the whole logic of the American dream, right? We were meant to be the ones that had a rigid class system, which you couldn't mount through, and you were meant to be the ones that had this, open market economy that allowed people with an entrepreneurial spirit to rise up into the next class and income strata, and that doesn't seem to be happening in the way that it's meant to. So, was there a moment, Kyla, where things started to get worse? And was there something that policymakers did or didn't do to exacerbate that change?
What has happened from a policy side is because the boomers vote and because they're highly represented in politics is they end up designing policy that benefits them. And so I think it's just been this like, decades long cycle where those who are in power want to stay in power. And that's the incentives that are placed before them. And they're going to design things to make it as such. And they're going to fight back against housing because they don't want their homes to somehow devalue. They're going to maybe not retire at the age that we would expect them to and not give up leadership positions. They're just going to stay. And that creates an element of stagnation for those that are trying to inherit what comes after. Baby boomers own, I think, like 75% of all wealth in the US. Like, there has not been a passing of the torch yet. And I think there's been a lot of regulation and a lot of bureaucratic red tape that we can't place blame purely on the boomers. We can't place blame purely on the boomers for a lot of things. But I think that there's been just kind of like when you look at the US and you really zoom out, it's the richest country in the world. And there's like refusal to support its citizens sometimes. We did see a lot of support like during the pandemic in terms of helping people with rent forbearance and student loan payments being paused. But I think that in the US it's fight or die in terms of how citizens have to live. And part of that is definitely policies that have been created by the older population. And it doesn't start with just the boomers, but it has a big impact on how people move throughout the economy.
Does it make you and your generation, your peers, want to kind of check out of the system? Does it produce a level of um, cynicism, disengagement, kind of distrust in the system that you think risks becoming permanent?
So there's a word called financial nihilism that the New York Times, I think they coined it, but it's basically that idea that people are totally checked out of saving out of for retirement. They're checked out of advancing in their career because they don't think there's a future for them. And so that's something I really worry a lot about is like if we lose hope, what comes after that and how do you reinstate it in people and what can you give them to hope in if the system isn't providing them the opportunities they expected. David Brooks has a great article out in the New York Times about the rejection economy and kind of like the endless rejection from dating apps to colleges to jobs as your kids are experiencing just like constant rejection and the cognitive load that plays and how it really can just stamp out any sense of hope in people. And so I do worry about that and coming through that on the other side.
Is there a country in the world that is getting this right, that is doing this at least better, that we could look to for examples?
I mean, I think we can learn from all sorts of countries. Like, I think the US really has to reconsider a social safety net, and Europe is a relatively good example there. I think a lot of countries are having trouble like figuring out what to do with their young people just because everybody's living so long in developed countries at this point. So I think there's a lot of lessons in the social safety net. I think Austria has done a pretty good job at building housing. They have social housing, but like, just stuff like that. It's like, can we just help people get their foot in the door? And there are examples that we can pull from.
What needs to change, Kyla? When you look at things that could change in terms of policy, what would be the things that you would point to? The top 3 things.
I mean, it's a simple answer, but fixing zoning, housing has to be built. Like, it's just, it's one of the only ways out of this. I think another thing is childcare costs. Like, those have really skyrocketed in the US. It's very difficult to figure out how to pay for that, especially as the US, struggles under current debt loads. But that's something that if we want to encourage people to have children and continue building out their lives in the US, like we have to figure out childcare costs. And then the other thing is elder care costs. And so that has, I think, on average, just like $10,000 a month to care for an aging person. That's also really difficult to figure out how to finance. But if we think about just sort of stabilizing the population, giving them somewhere to live, helping them have children, and then taking care of our aging population as they, move toward the whatever comes after this is super important. So that'd be the three things that I'd focus on.
Kyla, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.